Chosen one, stop scrolling for a second. Not because something urgent is about to happen, but because there's something subtle you might have been overlooking for a long time. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's one of those quiet details about yourself that most people ignore, even though it's been with you every single day. Your hair. Now, this isn't about trends. It's not about style advice, grooming rules, or what society says looks good. This is about something deeper, something more personal. Because if you've been paying attention to your own life lately, you might notice that the way you relate to your appearance, especially your hair, has been shifting. And that shift isn't random. There are phases where you care less. Phases where you suddenly want to change everything. Phases where you let it grow or feel the urge to cut it all off. And if you really think about it, those moments often line up with what's happening internally. That's where this conversation begins. Not with answers, but with awareness. Because sometimes the smallest external changes are reflections of something much bigger happening within you. There's a phase many people go through, and they don't talk about it enough. It's that period where you start feeling slightly disconnected from who you used to be. Not in a dramatic life crisis way. More like things that once felt like you don't fully fit anymore. Your habits feel off. Your routines feel forced. Even your reflection starts to feel unfamiliar some days. And during that time, something interesting happens. You start noticing details. The way you carry yourself. The way you speak. And yes, even something as simple as your hair. It becomes less about appearance and more about identity. Because when your internal world starts shifting, your external expression often tries to catch up. You may not say it out loud, but you feel it. A quiet sense that you're in between versions of yourself. Not who you were, not fully who you're becoming, just somewhere in the middle. And in that space, even small things start to matter in a different way. When small changes start feeling personal, there's a moment that catches people off guard. It's when something simple, like deciding whether to cut your hair or let it grow, suddenly feels significant. Not stressful, not overwhelming, just meaningful in a way it never used to be. Before, it might have been routine. You'd go for a haircut because it was time. You'd style it based on convenience. It didn't carry weight. But now, you hesitate. You think about it longer than usual. Because something inside you is asking a quiet question. Does this still feel like me? And that question isn't really about hair. It's about alignment. It's about whether your outer self still matches your inner state. This is often one of the first subtle signs of personal growth, not the loud, motivational kind, but the quiet, reflective kind. The kind where you start paying attention to how things feel, instead of just going through motions. You become more aware of your choices, more intentional, and sometimes more uncertain. Because when you're evolving, clarity doesn't always come immediately. Sometimes it shows up as questioning. And that questioning touches everything, even the smallest details. The urge to change without knowing why. At some point, you might felt it. That random, almost unexplainable urge to change something about your appearance. Not because of trends. Not because someone told you to. Just an internal pull. You look in the mirror and think, something needs to shift. But you can't fully explain what. So you consider your hair. Cut it. Grow it. Style it differently. And while it may seem like a surface-level decision, it's often connected to something deeper. Because change, in any form, is one of the ways humans process internal transitions. When your mindset shifts, when your priorities evolve, when your identity starts reshaping itself. Your brain looks for ways to express that externally, and appearance becomes one of the easiest outlets. It's visible, it's controllable, it feels immediate. But the real change isn't happening in the mirror. It's happening within. And the outer adjustment is just a reflection of that process. Letting go of old versions of yourself. There's something symbolic about changing your hair, even if you don't consciously think of it that way. It represents release, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, personal way. Think about it. How many times in your life did you make a noticeable change to your appearance? Right around the time something in your life shifted. A new phase, a new mindset, a new direction. It's not coincidence. It's a natural human pattern. Because letting go isn't always about big decisions. Sometimes it shows up in small acts. Choosing something different. Allowing yourself to move on from what felt familiar. And hair becomes part of that process. You're not just changing how you look. You're signaling to yourself, I'm not exactly who I was before. And that realization can feel both freeing and uncomfortable. Because growth isn't always clean. It's layered. You carry pieces of your past while stepping into something new. And sometimes, you need physical reminders to help your mind accept that transition. When you stop trying to impress, there's a shift that happens quietly. You stop thinking about how others perceive you as much as you used to. Not in a rebellious way, not in a careless way, just naturally. You start prioritizing how you feel over how you're seen. And this affects everything, including your appearance. You might simplify things, or you might experiment more. But the intention changes. It's no longer about approval. It becomes about comfort, authenticity, alignment. And this is where something important happens. You start making choices that reflect your internal state, not external expectations. That includes your hair. You don't style it for validation. You don't change it to fit in. You adjust it based on what feels right for you in that moment. And while this might seem like a small shift, it's actually a sign of deeper self-awareness. Because when you stop performing for the outside world, you start connecting more honestly with yourself. The quiet confidence that builds over time. Confidence isn't always loud. In fact, the most stable kind of confidence is almost invisible. It doesn't need attention. It doesn't need validation. It shows up in subtle ways. The way you carry yourself. The way you make decisions. The way you stop overthinking small things. And interestingly, it can even show up in how you relate to your own appearance. You become less reactive, less pressured to constantly change or fix things, more accepting, but also more intentional. If you decide to change something, it comes from a grounded place, not insecurity, not comparison, just choice. And that's a powerful place to be, because it means your identity isn't being shaped by external noise anymore. It's being shaped by awareness. Section 6, understanding what's really changing. At the end of the day, this isn't really about hair. It never was. It's about identity. It's about the slow, often invisible process of becoming more aware of who you are and who you're not anymore. It's about noticing the shifts that don't always get talked about. The quiet transitions, the internal rewiring, the moments where you feel slightly unfamiliar to yourself, not because something is wrong, but because something is evolving. And when you start seeing these patterns, you realize something important. Growth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up in small decisions, in subtle preferences, in the way you start relating to yourself differently, even in something as simple as how you see your own reflection. Toward the end of all this, there's a realization that begins to settle in. You're not trying to become someone else. You're just slowly uncovering parts of yourself that were always there, but maybe buried under expectations, routines, or old versions of thinking. And that process doesn't need to be rushed. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be noticed. Because awareness is what turns random moments into meaningful ones. If any part of this felt familiar to you, not because it sounded good, but because it actually reflected something you've experienced, then it might be worth sitting with that for a moment. Not reacting, not overanalyzing, just noticing. And if you feel like sharing your experience, your perspective, or even your own interpretation of these changes, you can add it to the conversation below. Sometimes hearing how others describe similar moments brings a different kind of clarity. There's another layer to this that most people don't immediately recognize. It's not just about change. It's about timing. Because if you look closely at your life, the moments where you felt drawn to adjust something about your appearance didn't happen randomly. They showed up during transitions. Not always big, obvious transitions, but internal ones. Moments where your thinking shifted, where your tolerance for certain things decreased, where your perspective became quieter but sharper. And during those periods, your relationship with yourself becomes more honest. You notice what feels forced. You notice what no longer represents you. And that awareness doesn't stay limited to thoughts. It begins to influence behavior. The mirror becomes more than a reflection. There comes a point where looking in the mirror stops being automatic. You don't just glance and move on. You pause, not because you're judging yourself, but because you're observing. You're trying to understand something subtle. Do I recognize this version of me? And sometimes the answer isn't immediate. Because when you're evolving internally, your external image can feel slightly behind. Not wrong, just not fully updated yet. That's where discomfort can show up. Not insecurity, but misalignment. And that feeling pushes you to make adjustments. Not to become someone new, but to feel more like yourself again. Your hair, being one of the most visible aspects of your appearance, naturally becomes part of that process. You notice it more. You question it more. You become more intentional with it. Because now it represents something beyond style. It represents identity alignment. The phase where nothing feels right. This is one of the most overlooked parts of growth. The in-between phase. The stage where nothing feels completely right, but nothing feels completely wrong either. You try different versions of yourself, different routines, different mindsets, different expressions, and sometimes none of them fully click. That can be frustrating because it feels like you're searching for something you can't clearly define. And during this phase, even small decisions like how you present yourself can feel heavier than usual. You might change your hair and still feel like something is off, not because you made the wrong choice, but because the internal process isn't finished yet. This is important to understand because many people misinterpret this phase. They think they're doing something wrong. They think they're stuck. But in reality, they're in the middle of redefinition. And redefinition isn't instant. It's gradual. It requires patience. It requires space. And sometimes, it requires sitting with that feeling of not fully knowing who you are yet. Detaching from old labels. At some point, you begin to realize that a lot of what you once identified with wasn't entirely chosen by you. It was influenced by environment, by expectations, by what felt acceptable at the time. And as you grow, you start questioning those things, not aggressively, just thoughtfully. You ask yourself, do I still connect with this? And sometimes the answer is no. That can be unsettling at first, because letting go of old labels means stepping into uncertainty. You're no longer defined by what you used to be, but you're not fully defined by what you're becoming either. And again, this shows up externally. The way you present yourself begins to shift. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Your choices become more personal, less influenced, more reflective of your current state rather than your past identity. And over time, that builds something important: a sense of ownership, learning to be comfortable with evolution. One of the biggest internal shifts you can go through is becoming comfortable with change, not forcing it, not resisting it, just allowing it, understanding that you're not supposed to stay the same, that your preferences will evolve, your mindset will evolve, your identity will evolve. And that's not instability. That's growth. When you accept this, you stop overreacting to small changes. You stop questioning yourself every time something shifts. You begin to trust the process, even when it's unclear, even when it feels incomplete. And that trust reflects in your behavior. You become more steady, more grounded, more patient with yourself, even in the way you handle your appearance. You're no longer trying to get it right. You're allowing yourself to adjust as you grow. The subtle return to simplicity. Interestingly, after phases of questioning, experimenting, and shifting, many people find themselves returning to something simpler, not because they're going backward, but because they've filtered out what doesn't feel necessary anymore. They've tried enough to understand what truly fits. And now, they don't feel the need to overcomplicate things. This simplicity isn't about doing less. It's about being more precise, more aligned, more intentional, even in something as simple as how you maintain your hair. It's no longer about constant change. It's about consistency that feels natural. And that consistency creates a sense of calm, a sense of stability, because you're no longer searching. You're settling into yourself. Identity isn't fixed, and that's the point. There's a belief many people carry without realizing it, that they need to figure themselves out once, and that's it. But that's not how it works. Identity isn't a final destination. It's an ongoing process. It shifts as you gain experience, as you learn, as you unlearn. And when you understand this, you stop putting pressure on yourself to have everything defined. You allow space for change. You allow space for uncertainty. And that creates something powerful: flexibility, the ability to adapt without losing yourself, the ability to evolve without feeling unstable. And that's where real growth happens, not in fixed definitions, but in continuous awareness. Somewhere along this journey, you start to notice something subtle. You're not reacting to yourself the way you used to. You're not overanalyzing every detail. You're not trying to control every outcome. You're observing more, judging less, adjusting naturally. And that shift is one of the clearest signs that something within you has matured. Take a second and think about your own experience. Not in a complicated way. Just honestly, have there been moments where you felt different internally? and noticed small external changes following that. Not because you planned it, but because it felt natural. That connection is worth paying attention to, because it tells you something important. You're becoming more aware of yourself. Not all at once, but gradually. And that awareness is what shapes everything else. If this perspective connects with you in any way, you can share your thoughts, your experience, or even where you feel you are in this process. Not for validation, just to add your voice to the conversation. Sometimes hearing different viewpoints brings a level of clarity that thinking alone doesn't. If this message made you pause for a moment, don't rush past that feeling. Sometimes it's not about finding answers right away, but about noticing what's already shifting inside you. And if anything in this reflection connected with your own experience, take it as a reminder to slow down and pay attention to your own growth, not from pressure, but from awareness. I'd genuinely like to know what this brought up for you. Not a perfect answer, not something deep for the sake of sounding deep, just your honest thoughts. What part of this felt familiar in your own life? And if you're going through your own phase of change right now, you're not alone in that process. Keep observing, keep learning yourself, and allow your own understanding to unfold in its own way. We'll continue exploring these kinds of reflections together in the next one.